My name is Vahid Aryadus from National Institute of Education of Nanyang Technological University. I'm delighted to be here today with you, and I would be talking about the assessment of listening in a bit. Yes, as Fista mentioned, and as you all know, our world is now facing a very weird and bizarre situation, something that we have never experienced perhaps in our lifetime. So we are now trying to come up with new methods of teaching and especially assessment. I say especially because that's my field of research. So without any further ado, I would like to start my presentation. I think I need to share my slides with you. So let me see if I can get it started. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, so let me go to slideshow mode. Okay, so my presentation is about assessing listening comprehension, what and how. It's basically an introduction to the assessment of listening with focus on theory, a theory of listening assessment. At the end of the talk, I will also mention a few words about using new technologies, especially in this time that we need, we need to move on from the usual physical teachings and assessment to a different mode of assessment and teaching. I think using some mobile and computer assisted technologies would be of help. So I will present something on that. Like I said, I would like to start off by talking about theory. Those of you who know Richard Feynman, who was a physicist, you have probably also read this statement. This might be a Richard Feynman statement because some people think that it's not. But it says, what I cannot create, I do not understand. Actually, you can flip it around and say, what I don't understand, I cannot create. And that actually refers here, I would like to use it to refer to the assessment of listening comprehension. What I would like to say is that you, in order to be able to create listening assessments or listening tests, we must first understand what listening is, and then move on from that understanding to devising the listening comprehension tests. So I will spend a little bit of time to discuss listening theories and then listening constructs. And after that, I will move on to some of the basic principles of choosing texts for listening assessment. And then I'll move on to MAL or mobile assisted language learning, and of course, assessment. The main framework of the presentation is based on the test specification of Charles Allison's book called Assessing Reading, as you see in the left corner, bottom left corner. It's a test, it's a book on assessing reading, but I think it's equally applicable to listening comprehension. As you see, I have created a hexagon based on what he has presented in his book. This hexagon has, 8 sides, starting from the purpose of the test. Then if you move clockwise, you will arrive at listening constructs and listening strategies. Actually, these two concepts are very interrelated and are kind of intertwined. So a lot of researchers do not discuss them as separate entities. For example, if you look at the theory of communicative competence, you would see that strategies like metacognitive and cognitive strategies are assumed to be a part of our language ability. So I will discuss these two at the same time. When we are talking about the listening construct, we need to take into consideration two possible threats to the validity of the tests. And these threats are actually, the discussion of these threats comes from Samuel Messick's work. One is the underrepresentation of the listening or other constructs that you want to measure. And the other one is the presence of construct irrelevant variance. Then I will very briefly talk about other aspects, including learners' characteristics, textual features, task features, expected responses, and scales. Now, what I would like to elaborate before I go on is this very interesting and I think important quotation from Charles Alderson. He said in the same book, what matters in the end is the extent to which we can generalize from assessment procedures or tests to listening, or in his word, reading, I just replaced it, listening performance in the real world situation or in the real world. And this is actually a definition of authenticity. Authenticity is actually the correspondence between the tasks or the tests that we develop and the actual language performance in the real world. So what we are developing, whether it's a listening test or reading test or anything else, it has to be a good representation of what happens in the language performance in the real world. So any sort of fanciful kind of test that doesn't correspond or doesn't relate to the real life situations is not an authentic test, or has a kind of weak authenticity. Therefore, we need to take this into consideration in our test specifications. Now, the first thing that I mentioned in the previous slide was the purpose of listening assessment. I think it's an easy concept, so I don't spend too much time here. You know, sometimes we're tasked with developing a general language proficiency test in which we need to develop a listening proficiency test as well. Therefore, that test has the purpose of assessing listening proficiency of test takers. Now, sometimes we're asked to develop a test that represents oracy skills. The term oracy was for the first time used or maybe coined by Wilkinson in 1965, quite a few decades ago, but it still continues to be used. And what it actually means is listening and speaking. Then under this purpose, listening becomes one of the subcomponents of oracy. Sometimes we test the achievement of listening comprehension in a classroom, or we just want to really develop a quick quiz. That's an in-class assessment in our for our test, or we might want to develop a diagnostic test or a test for placement or anything else. Whatever we do, I believe that we should really note this down carefully and elaborate what I mean by, for example, being a placement test or being a diagnostic test or an in-class assessment or something else, because that will help us develop the specification and a definition of our construct. So let's say we have done this and we know what the purpose of our assessment is. What is the second stage? The second stage is construct representation, or the definition of listening, the definition of the listening construct that we want to measure. I think this analogy is helpful. On the left-hand side, you see this iceberg. I know the icebergs have been used, have been overused in different fields or in different presentations, but I think they continue to be very useful, because what we see in a listening assessment or a listening test is the tip of the iceberg, and that's the test itself. But the test is built and devised upon a construct. That's something that we do not see immediately. It's not visible. So we need to dig into the test to find out what kind of construct it's measuring. And the construct itself is based on a theoretical framework or a theory of listening comprehension. Theories are sometimes used, the word theory is sometimes used interchangeably with model. I know that some people do not think that models and theories are the same. I think I'm not going to get into that debate because that's going to take a long time to talk about. But I think what we need to know is that a theory is different from a construct, in my view. Again, a lot of people, perhaps in language assessment, take these two as analogous or synonymous. I think they're not. And even Charles Alderson in his book also differentiates between construct and theory. So in my opinion, a theory is a body of knowledge that defines the mechanism or the phenomenon clearly, and also specifies the components of that mechanism or that phenomenon. and also their relationships, the relationships of those components. So it's like a broad representation of listening comprehension without, regardless of where that listening comprehension is taking place. A construct becomes more specific and more to the point, and it meaning that it actually defines that mechanism within a specific context for a particular group of people or test takers. And also, when we use the word construct, we actually mean that we want to measure that trait. Whereas when we say theory, the term or the concept of measurement is not implied. So if I say I'm developing a construct of listening, that means I'm developing something, some plan, some blueprint that helps me test or assess or measure, if you will, the listening ability. So throughout this presentation, I will use theory or construct wherever they're applicable. Then based on the construct, I develop the test. The process of changing a construct or translating a construct into a test is called operationalization. When we realize the construct, we generate or we develop a test. So let's see what we got under theories and constructs first, and then we can discuss tests. There are actually three groups of theories, two major ones, one eclectic. This is how I look into listening comprehension. Some other people might actually have a different opinion. So I have mentioned competency-based models. That's one thing. Two is domain models. Actually, domain models can be operationalized into task-based constructs on the right-hand side. The task-based constructs are those that do not necessarily take into consideration the thought processes or the cognitive processes of test takers. Rather, what they focus on, what they care about, is what a language user can do. For example, if this person is able to communicate on a university campus, or if the person is able to communicate with his or her supervisor, or in meetings, or is he able to present something at a conference, etc. That's a kind of task-based definition of constructs. On the other hand, we have competency-based constructs, such as cognitive processes and subskill-based processes. There are two different types, in other words. What I would like to do is to focus on the competency-based models. The reason is, one is really a practical reason, that's at the interest of time. Two is that these two they seem to me to be the kind of more researched ideas in language assessment. So I would like to focus on these two specifically. Now, first, what is a cognitive process? And then how do we differentiate it from a subskill-based process kind of model, a subskill-based model? A cognitive process model assumes that there are certain cognitive processes that take place during listening that actually are executed in the mind. Or I have written here the brain continuously. Of course, in language assessment, the role of the brain has hardly been investigated. I personally prefer to use the brain because a lot of neuroscientists actually have argued that there is nothing called the mind, there's only the brain. I mean, that's a topic for a different presentation, maybe when COVID-19 is over. But in my opinion, I think the brain would be a better terminology to use. Anyway, whichever you use, the definition would be, I think, straightforward and easy to understand. It has to do with the processes that are executed in the brain continuously. How are these models or theories developed? They're typically based on cognitive interviews, if you look into the literature in language assessment or even language learning research. But in cognitive psychology, especially when it comes to reading comprehension research, you'll see that a lot of experiments have been devised and designed to investigate the different cognitive processes of readers. I like that approach, and I hope that one day this approach will also pick up in the field of language assessment. More recently, they have used other devices such as eye tracking, and I'm happy to say that my research team has been using brain scanning, a kind of brain scanning method called FNIRS, which stands for Functional Near Infrared Spectroscopy. These are the methods through which we can think about and investigate cognitive processes. What is a subskill-based model? Well, it has to do with the scores. Now, let me just give you a background quickly. Let's say you develop a test of listening comprehension, which consists of 40 test items, 40. You administer the test to a large group of people, let's say 500 people, or if you're lucky, 1,000 people, for a specific purpose. For example, you want to measure their proficiency in listening comprehension in English or a different language, like in Bahasa Indonesia or something else. Now, then you collect the data, that is the scores on each test item per person. For example, someone got a 0 on item 1, whereas another person got a 1, 0, 1, all the way. It's a dichotomous test, let's say. Now, a subskill-based approach would allow you to submit the scores to some quantitative data analysis. So it actually tries to reverse engineer from the scores the processes that test takers would probably, or the subskills that the test takers probably executed during listening comprehension. So it doesn't look directly into the mind or into the brain of the test taker, but it looks at their performance, the end product of their performance, and uses statistical analysis in order to model the variance in the data and basically find out whether there are subskills underlying that test performance or not. How does it work? I think a very good explanation or elaboration would be, let's say you have got 40 test items. In these 40 test items are submitted to exploratory fact analysis. And once it's done, then the results might be that you find that there are separate clusters of items. One cluster of item including 5 items, another cluster of items including, another cluster of items including, I don't know, 10 items, another cluster including 6 items, and so on and so forth. You see that this technique reduces 40 items into, let's say, 4 clusters. Now you go through the clusters of items through their contents to figure out if there is anything that connects or links these items. And then whatever you find through this content analysis or content processing is called a subskill. Therefore, the subskill-based approach starts from the data and cluster them, and then experts or professionals, professional test developers or teachers step in and read those clusters of items to figure out if there's anything that clusters the items together. So the whole idea is based on the concept of heterogeneity of variance. In other words, the fact that these items are clustered separately from one another shows that the variation of test scores and performance in one cluster is different enough, is sufficiently different from another, the variation of another cluster. Therefore, they are separable and disparate. Therefore, we have disparate and separable subskills. Now, each of these 2 models have been investigated in the literature of language assessment and language learning. I aim to provide a few examples, two examples to be specific, for cognitive process models, and maybe 4 or 5 examples for subskills-based models. The reason is that subskills-based models have been investigated more often. So here are the 2 examples of cognitive process models that help us understand what listening is. The first one is from Field 2008. It's a book, quite a useful one. It assumes that listening comprehension is is a continuous process which starts from input decoding and moves all the way up to discourse constructions. On the other hand, at the bottom of this slide, you will see three rectangles. One is surface level, text-based level, and the other one is situation model. Well, these are the three major components of Walter Kinch construction integration model of comprehension. So I'm going to present them together because that will be more useful. So I can create a kind of mapping for both of these two models, and you'll see that they're quite closely related to each other. So the first model on top is the Fields model, which starts from input decoding, which is where listeners transform acoustic cues into groups of syllables. And that's when you hear them through your auditory senses, or that's your ears, you transmit the signals as electrical pulses all the way to the brain, to mostly the right and left side of the brain, and then you start to process them. The first part of the brain, or one of the first regions of the brain that is responsible for this analysis, is the inferior frontal gyrus, or IFG, which is right here in the left corner, in the left side of the brain, or some people on the right side of the brain. So the analysis or the processes is done there, and then syllables are figured out. Then the second stage would be a lexical search, where the listener tries to identify the best word level matches for those syllables, because it tries to decode them and recode them back into words. In order to recode them into words, the listener is supposed to retrieve the relevant information from the long-term memory, which mainly exists in our hippocampus, which is a subcortical area of the brain. Then following the lexical search, and of course, I would like to add another word here, lexical segmentation. That's where you your brain tries to segment the words, because as you are now listening to me, you don't see any spaces, or you don't hear any spaces between the words. It's the job of our brain to figure out separate words and then put them together. That's called lexical segmentation. During lexical segmentation, or like a very short period of time after lexical segmentation is done, meaning is attached by the brain, meaning is attached to the word that has been segmented. Now, some scholars say that lexical segmentation and meaning association take place at the same time. Some people say that they are separate processes. I think that's a topic for another discussion. And after you figure out these separate words, you need to string them together. How do we string them together? We need another ability called syntactic ability. So we call upon our syntactic knowledge in order to be able to string together the words, a process which is called parsing. Actually, it's used in computer sciences as well. After parsing, we create, or during the parsing, we create sentences or representations of sentences in the mind, or in the brain, if you will. These representations are in the form of propositions, and they are almost immediately converted into mental imagery, visual mental imagery, wherever it is possible. So those representations are not connected to each other yet. We have, for example, 20 representations of whatever we have heard. This is what Walter Kinch refers to as the text base. So a text base is a mental representation of the auditory message, which is not coherent yet, which doesn't have a very good and cogent structure. Now, what our brain starts to do is to identify those gaps within the text space and try to eliminate the gaps, that is filling in the gaps, by using our world knowledge, by using experiences that we have accumulated, and anything that we actually know, our opinions, our beliefs, and so on and so forth. This process is called top-down processing. That's a process through which we add things to the passage which do not actually exist in the passage itself. Therefore, this top-down processing could be quite different from person to person. The output of this reprocessing of the text space is a more coherent and cogent representation, which we refer to as the situation model. This is actually something that Kinch has mentioned in his construction integration model of comprehension. So the situation model is that representation, the cogent and coherent representation of the passage, which actually means or includes whatever we have understood from the passage. Now, one of the important takeaways from these two models for assessment or even for teaching listening comprehension is that we need to focus our attention on the assessment of the situation model. That's whatever they have learned, rather than the assessment of words or, I don't know, syllables and so on and so forth. Actually, the stage from input all the way through parsing is the pre-comprehension stage. The comprehension stage starts from meaning construction and all the way to discourse construction. So if we want to measure listening or assess listening comprehension, we want to focus on these two stages with the primary focus on the situation model itself. Now let's move on to the idea of subskills. As you saw in the cognitive processing analysis, the cognitive processing configuration of listening comprehension, things move linearly things have been represented that way, but of course they're not really linear. They could get really nonlinear. But the thing is, we often do not have that clear-cut boundaries in a real-life situation. Things happen in a blink of an eye, and we understand things quite online. So we're talking about a process there. But when it comes to subskill-based models, we're not anymore dealing with the process. We're dealing with some components which are multi-divisible, some skills. So that idea of continuity and the idea of process is not there anymore in subskill-based models. So what matters here is the size of the grain. Should the grain be coarse or fine? And what do I mean by that? It really means the size of the subskills. If you look at, and I will show you in a second, if you look at some of these frameworks or models, you will see that the listening comprehension has been divided into multiple small subskills. On the other hand, there are models that do not break them down into so many subskills. They just break them down into a few coarse-grained sort of subskills, and I think that's probably more measurable. It lends itself to measurement more than if you try to break them down into like a million different kind of subskills. Here, I would like to start off by providing this basic subskill model. Actually, I put this together based on my understanding of the available literature. If you guys are interested to, for example, develop one, you can also develop one for yourself. But you need to take into consideration whom you are developing this model for. Like, are you developing it for measuring kids in primary school or for secondary school? Things can be different depending on who this model is for, and I have examples to share you later. At the bottom of this hierarchy, that's level 1, you have the subskill of the identification of sounds and prosody and prosodic patterns. Then as you move up to the top side of this hierarchy, these subskills presumably get more difficult to execute or to master. For example, level 2 is comprehending vocabulary, but if you jump to level 6, it's the ability to identify attitudes, views, opinions. For example, the ability to figure out whether someone is being sarcastic or does he really mean it when he says something. And that's not a skill purely based on the vocabulary, but it's a skill based on your understanding of vocabulary, intonation, gesture, facial expressions, and so on and so forth, and the context in which you are located. So it's probably a more sophisticated sort of subskill than like number 3, for example, the ability to understand phrases and sentences. Okay, so I'm going to move on and show you one of the first models that was proposed by Jack Richards. You've probably heard his name. He actually has written quite a lot on language learning. This is one of the first models that he proposed, subskill-based model of comprehension. He used the word macro skills and micro skills, which I think implies similar concepts. As you see, there are 16 just in this slide. Actually, there's a lot more to that. You can go to the paper and read from pages 229 to 239. You'll see a long list of subskills. It has been critiqued because scholars who read it believe that it's anecdotal, meaning that you don't have rigorous scientific or quantitative evidence to support the existence and separation of these subskills from each other. And actually, there is a large range here. So I would say that it could be a useful heuristic for teachers. For example, if you look at number 1, which is the ability to identify purposes and scopes of a lecture, and compare it with just randomly, let's say, number 16, the ability to recognize instructional and learner tasks such as warnings, recommendations, advice, and instructions, you'll get a good idea that there is a wide range of situations and conditions in which listening takes place. So as a teacher, you might want to expose your students to lecture comprehension, to understanding a conversation in which recommendations are being made, advice is being given to someone, instructions are given, and so on and so forth. Now, another subskill model that I would like to present is the one that was quantitatively validated. I did this study in 2018. I used quite a few quantitative models. I compared them. If you're interested to know more about the models, I'm happy to talk about it after the talk is over. But just to mention that the model is called cognitive diagnostic model or cognitive diagnostic analysis. So I identified 9 test items. 9 subskills within 40 or 30. I don't exactly remember. I think it was 30 test items, 9 subskills. Some of the test items actually were designed to measure more than one subskill based on my observations. For example, the first one is the ability to eliminate inaccurate information. And as you read this, you would know that this is very test specific, because in real life conversations, we might not have to do this a lot. I mean, it depends on how you define authenticity and the TLU domain, that's the target language use domain. The ability to make paraphrases, the ability to make pragmatic inferences, and so on and so forth. So 9 subskills emerged in this study, whereas in this second study, which was conducted 3 years before that, 5 subskills emerged, but this is a different condition and situation. The previous study was a study of listening comprehension in secondary schools in Singapore. This one is a proficiency test of test takers who apply to universities in North America. They have to take some proficiency tests, one of which is the MILAB, Michigan English Language Assessment Battery. So this test was actually designed by Michigan Language Assessment. And we found out, together with my co-author, Professor Goh, we found out that there were 5 subskills, including understanding and responding to the unexpected statements, understanding details and explicit statements, making close paraphrases, understanding making 2 types of paraphrases, inferences, propositional and enabling inferences. And here is how we did it, because I have been talking about factor analysis and quantitative models in subskill-based research. So this is one kind of factor analysis. It's a confirmatory factor analysis, actually. So we use a software package called Lizral, as you see in this slide. The image that emerged was quite interesting, because we realized that the listening comprehension, which as tested by MILAB, could not only be divided into those 5 subskills, but also these 5 subskills have a higher order listening factor that causes them, that contributes to the variation in them. So what is the implication of this analysis for the test developer, or for you if you're doing or designing a similar test? What it means is, look, the scores can be given to the students, can be reported to students in 2 ways. Form 1, you can provide them with a holistic score, like your score is 90, for example, out of 100, or 70 out of 100. And that's the listening construct right in the left-hand side of this figure. Now, you can also break it down into subskills or subscores. You say, okay, you got a 70 in your listening, and also your ability to understand explicit information is this, your ability to understand implicitly stated information is this, and so on and so forth. So this becomes like a kind of diagnostic information that you can provide your students with. Unless you have evidence that your test can be broken down into subskills, it's not advisable to provide subscores, because those subscores do not make much sense.
Okay, Dr. Fahim, I'm sorry for interrupting. You still have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. Now, one more slide here is the upper primary secondary school syllabus in Singapore. You can see that they have specified subskills here. For example, understanding gist, details, inferences, the purposes of listening, make the ability to make prediction, and anticipating the input, etc. Another one is PSLE, which is a high-stakes test in Singapore, which is basically based around literal and inferential comprehension and the ability to draw conclusions and understanding main ideas, details, etc. And the difficulty, in my view, increases as you go from 1 to 3. Now, the other one is the ordinary O-level listening. As you see, the construct has been spelled out in this document like this. They talk about, if you look at section A, they talk about listening skills, then they talk about the different types of texts. That's the second factor. And also they talk about the different types of items. That's the third factor. So on top of subskills, which they haven't actually explicitly stated what kind of subskills they mean, on top of that, they have types of texts and types of questions or items. And now the question is, so after reading and listening to you talking about so many models, so what should we do? How should we test listening comprehension? I would say this model by Gary Buck is really useful, which is called the default listening construct. He says when you don't have a good idea what to measure with your test or what to assess, you can start from a default listening construct and then expand it according to the needs of your classroom or beyond classroom assessments. So one thing to consider is to consider the use of extended samples of realistic spoken language. The other thing is that you should create items that test understanding linguistic information, and also create items that test understanding inferred meanings or the ability to make inferences. I think it's a good idea to, if you really want to develop tests in listening, it's a good idea to read Gary Buck's book. In a recent co-citation analysis, we found that Gary Buck's book, although it was published in 2001, it continues to be the most influential textbook in language assessment, specifically in the assessing of listening comprehension. So it's a good idea to have a copy of this book. Okay, this is one example of using this default listening construct by Elvis Wagner. He used the default construct to investigate what some test items actually measure. If you're interested to look at the paper, it's useful. I just wanted to mention about textual features in listening as well, because you need to choose a text for assessing listening. You need to look into the speech rate, pauses between ideas, familiar, if the pronunciation is familiar or not, natural intonation, because some texts are actually read by machines. And these days, you probably hear that a lot. And some of these machines do not have a natural intonation, so it might be very difficult for some students to understand that. Whether there's complex grammar and so on and so forth. In the interest of time, I have to go through this. Just wanted to mention that finally you can use Coh-Metrix Easability Assessor to also get an idea about the difficulty level of the text that you choose for your students. There are 5 measures that Coh-Metrix Easability Assessor can provide you with, including narrativity, syntactic simplicity, word concreteness, referential, and deep cohesion. But provides you with some percentage. Okay, so one last thing. I hope, Fisa, you can just give me 2 more minutes, because it's really cool and interesting to know. So all of us have got mobiles, right? Well, there is one field of research in computer-assisted language learning called mobile-assisted language learning, or MAL for short. What I'm suggesting is that you can do some part of your formative assessments or even teaching of listening comprehension through MAL, mobile-assisted language learning. Why is it so? One of the advantages of MAL is its mobility across time and across space. Look, learners can carry, and they do carry their mobiles. Actually, it's so ubiquitous, it's so universal that you cannot imagine someone walking without his phone in his hand, looking at it, or in his pocket. So learners carry it around. There are different mobile technologies that are emerging every day, and you can just install them on your phone and carry them around with you. And also the content. You can download everything from the cloud onto your phone, or as you're walking, just connect to the cloud, for example, on YouTube or any other software kind of software, and listen to something and learn something. Therefore, flexibility, continuity, accessibility, and adaptability, according to Lowen and the colleagues, are some of the most important advantages that MAL offers to us. In one word, MAL is a flexible, continuing, adaptive language learning process with easy access to language learning materials supported by mobile devices. And one last thing, I promise this is the last thing.
Okay.
So you might be asking if MAL has ever been applied to listening comprehension and reading research as well. I also review research into reading because it's closely related to listening. In reading, it's a lot more, as you see on the left part of the screen. On listening, on the right side, well, it's relatively less. It's good news and bad news. Bad news because what we know about the application of MAL in listening research is limited. But it's good news because there's a lot of research gap out there for us. And if you're interested in researching listening comprehension, there's a lot of research questions waiting for you. These studies that I have cited, actually, Kathy, my MA student, has created these 2 slides for me with very special thanks to her. These show that multimodal learning is ubiquitous, is around us, and it seems to be an kind of effective way for enhancing learning motivation and achievements. It's been shown in the study of listening. And I hope that you'll consider using your students and yourself, your own phones, in the assessment and teaching of listening comprehension in one way or another. There are many apps out there. You can use those apps, especially given that we are facing this so-called new normal. We must become more innovative with the devices that we are using. So this brings me to the end of this presentation. These are some of the references, or perhaps all the references that I've used. If you have any questions, yeah, more references. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer if I can. And if you have suggestions, I'd be very happy to hear them. Thank you very much.